Blah, blah, blah.
CO2 emissions, what actual amount do you think is permissible?
The science doesn't really work that way.
It is very naive of us. We will have to fundamentally change our society. We are unstoppable. Another world is possible.
Greta Thunberg has a lot of influence on particularly young people.
She's doing this for the message. It's not about ego at all. She has no interest in the press. She has no interest in being this leader.
Again, what do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it?
This leader. I think she wants to be a striker like anyone else. It really feels like it's for the bigger picture. So she carries this sign, which is School Strike for Climate in Swedish.
How well argued are Greta's opinions, and how reliable are her persuasion techniques? To find out, this video looks at Greta's word choice and behavior in different speeches and interviews. Welcome or welcome back. Let's go for it.
It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure. It should be obvious that we cannot solve a crisis with the same methods that got us into it in the first place.
What other methods are there but political and diplomatic meetings? What exactly is Greta suggesting? It sounds more like she needs this to be a failure so that she'll still have a following. Less profit and popularity in being or pretending to be upset and unsatisfied. Just ask this billion-dollar victim.
I'm Taylor. Good evening. They're saying I'm dating too much in my 20s? Okay, I'll stop. Or have you ever heard someone say about a male artist, I really like his songs, but I don't know what it is. There's just something about him I don't like. No, that criticism is reserved for us. The toxic male privilege in our industry.
It should be obvious.
Groupthink-based rhetoric doesn't leave room for people in the crowd who might think differently. People are addressed as a group and are expected to understand and agree as a group. Next, Greta keeps presupposing agreement.
And more people are starting to realize this. Many are starting to ask themselves, what will it take for the people in power to wake up?
Greta frequently repeats this presupposition, giving the impression that she's speaking for the people, and thus creating an us and them discourse.
And during this time, more and more people around the world have woken up to the climate and ecological crisis, putting more and more pressure on you, the people in power.
Greta even answers personal questions as if she's speaking on behalf of a group.
You've galvanized so many people to come together and sort of fight for this cause. How does that feel personally?
Of course, it's very difficult to describe. We never thought that it would be possible to do anything like that in the beginning. Someone needs to take action, and we are someone.
This kind of constitutive rhetoric is about getting people to see or think, depending on how you look at it, that they're part of the same we, being called to act by their leader.
But let's be clear, they are already awake. They know exactly what they are doing. They know exactly what priceless values they are sacrificing to maintain business as usual.
Political and ideological speeches are structured around narratives, and narratives are about persuasion. In order for persuasion to happen, the audience must be able to identify themselves with the speaker, the self-proclaimed protagonist, personally as well as morally. Here, Greta presupposes priceless values, as if these values are shared by everyone, which isn't necessarily the case. And next, Greta indirectly reveals that her views are based on a lot more than the science that she claims they're based on. Let's watch.
This is an active choice by the leaders to continue to let the exploitation of people and nature and the destruction of present and future living conditions to take place.
And what about the living conditions under the rule of someone like Greta, who, as she's about to reveal, wants drastic changes? What will that look like? What will that mean for each individual family's way of life? We're already seeing some consequences in form of high prices.
You can always have these big corporations that put pressures on the consumers to make changes in their lives, spend a little bit more money on having like sustainable makeup wipes and
Yes, we can always do that. The prices aren't high enough. If only people would just spend a little bit more money, so that the politicians can spend their money for them. Where does it end? In debates, speakers have to ground and detail their claims and suggestions. In speeches, speakers can hide behind the convenient monologue format, and that's what Greta's doing. Next, Greta has more ideological presuppositions that she'd like to share with us.
And the climate and ecological crisis, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is directly tied to other crises and injustices that date back to colonialism and beyond. Crises based on the idea that some people are worth more than others and therefore have the right to steal others, to exploit others, and to steal their land and resources. And the climate crisis is, of course, only a symptom of a much larger crisis. A crisis of inequality that dates back to colonialism and beyond. A crisis based on the idea that some people are worth more than others, and it is very naive to believe that we can solve this crisis without confronting the roots of it.
Of course, and naive, she says assertively, appealing to alleged shared knowledge that the connection between the crisis and the past is this simple and one-dimensional. The purpose of the shared knowledge technique is to avoid objections, as if there's no other way of looking at it than the way the speaker's looking at it. This is another aspect of constitutive rhetoric, oversimplified and sometimes even inaccurate connections between past and present events. Never mind that big and small companies also create jobs, making it possible for people to survive. The verb steal and the presupposition that the antagonists actually think that some people are worth more than other people underline the ideological aspect of her worldview. These presuppositions are disputable to say the least, not objective science. Nevertheless, Greta repeats this narrative verbatim in her speeches. The fact that it's verbatim is revealed by her self-correction.
And therefore had the right to steal others, to exploit others.
I'm wondering, what happens when there's no script?
This is a question for Greta. How do you find the center where we're actually reducing carbon emissions and find compromise?
I mean, can I hand over that question? Because
I had to address it because it came up during the roundtable.
I think anyone could answer that question.
Yeah,
You've spoken enough. I think.
Never mind. Back to the video where Greta keeps appealing to alleged shared knowledge.
And it is very naive of us to think that we could solve this crisis without addressing the root cause of it.
Even the facial expressions are the same.
And it is very naive. And it is very naive.
Presupposing that if you don't agree with Greta's solution, you're naive. But what exactly is Greta's solution besides addressing the root cause, whatever that means?
Addressing the root cause of it.
What will that mean for the average citizen? Is it really naive to not believe a solution that the speaker doesn't even explain in detail? Or could this level of intentional vagueness actually mean that it's the speech that's naive? Ambiguity is the glue of politics. It allows people to agree on laws and policies, because they can read different meanings into the words, which seems to be the case here.
But this is not going to be spoken about inside the COP. It's just too uncomfortable.
Or maybe it's because she hasn't specified what exactly they should be talking about. With her rhetoric, Greta portrays herself as a friend of the people, but which specific and detailed plans does she have in mind? And how will these plans affect people?
It's much easier for them to simply ignore the historical debt that the countries of the global north have towards the most affected people and areas.
In another speech, Greta went as far as making this claim.
But the climate crisis was created by us, the nations of the global north.
And again, if you don't agree with these connections, with this kind of addressing the root cause, you're naive. It sounds a lot like it's not only the antagonists that look for easy solutions.
The COP has turned into a PR event where leaders are giving beautiful speeches and announcing fancy commitments and targets.
And of course, she wouldn't know anything about beautiful speeches and PR.
I want to dedicate this prize to those protecting the Hambach forests and to the climate activists who fight to keep the fossil fuels in the ground everywhere.
You've this book here, as Phil said, you win the award for the heaviest book. I mean,
I have spent the last 1 year and a half putting together a book. These crises are the biggest story in the world, and it must be spoken as far and as wide as our voices can carry, and much further still. It must be told in books and articles, in movies and songs, at breakfast tables, lunch meetings and family gatherings, in lifts, at bus stops and in rural shops, on social media and the evening news, on dusty country roads and in the streets and alleys of our towns and cities. Everywhere, all the time. Everywhere, all the time.
It's strange how Greta seems to have a lot in common with the antagonist in her narrative. Who would have thought?
Fancy commitments and targets.
So which commitments and targets does Greta propose instead?
What in your opinion, is on the ppm, parts per million, what is acceptable, permissible on CO2 emissions, in your opinion? What actual amount do you think is permissible?
Well, I mean, of course, there is no magic amount that says that this is an okay amount. The science doesn't really work that way. But of course, we can say that it is the higher the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is, the bigger the risks are going to be. So, I mean, you can't say that there's one amount that is acceptable and not. Of course, there's not one magic tipping point where everything is beyond saving and so on. But rather, we should try to keep it as low as possible.
This is the perfect way to make sure that there's no end goal, so that she and like-minded people can keep selling books and increase prices. She was asked about acceptable amounts, but turns it into a question about there not being
one magic tipping point.
So if she can't say what an acceptable amount is, how can she know what an unacceptable amount is? Because unlike what she claims, science does indeed deal with terms like acceptable and unacceptable, in terms of what can be measured and tested. So is there actually any basis for her many scare tactics?
You have said, quote, "I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day." Is there what particular study or scientific report did you read that made you come to this conclusion?
Thank you for your question. First of all, let me just clear that those are metaphors. In speeches, you often use metaphors. Of course, I don't mean literally that I want people to panic.
I guess anything goes, as long as we say it's a metaphor. Hey, how do you like working here? I like it a lot, sir. You're fired. Sir? Relax, it's just a metaphor. A metaphor for what, sir? You know, to make sure you always do your very best and work overtime whenever needed. By the way, sir, about that overtime. As you know, I've been working overtime for the past 5 weeks. Will I get paid for? Look at that, it's almost noon. How about you go buy us some lunch? That wasn't a metaphor.
Oh, okay, so you didn't say that.
I did, but it's a metaphor that you often use in speeches.
Metaphor for what? Well, I mean, how do you, what I'm asking on panic, I want you to panic. What does that, tell me what you meant by that?
By that, I mean that I want people to step out of their comfort zones. Yeah.
There's nothing like appealing to other speeches to avoid holding yourself accountable.
That you often use in speeches.
Of course, we all knew what you meant because we can read each other's minds like that. Imagine if criminals used this tactic. It's correct that I said that and wrote that, but I was just using metaphors, so you should let me go.
While behind the curtains, the governments of the global north countries are still refusing to take any drastic climate action.
What drastic action? How can she know what's needed when she can't specify acceptable and unacceptable amounts of emission? To say that Greta's convenient protagonist-antagonist narrative is starting to collapse is an understatement that's bigger than any number of emissions that anyone can imagine.
And COP26 has been named the most exclusionary COP ever.
Yes, and conversely, everything Greta said has been so inclusive, totally open to critical thinking and different viewpoints.
And it is very naive of us. This is now a global greenwash festival. A 2-week-long celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah.
Blah blah blah. I think I've heard this before.
There is no planet B. There is no planet blah. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah.
And they are pretending that they have solutions to the climate crisis and that they are taking sufficient action. But we see through their lies and we see through their blah, 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 and we are tired of it.
And of course, Greta's speeches aren't blah blah blah. No, they're highly specific and nuanced every time. Greta points to so-called intentional causes, which is the most powerful offensive position to take because it lays the blame directly at someone's feet. Problems or harms are understood as direct consequences of willful human action. Speakers' rhetoric is most often dominated by intentional causes. The reason for this is twofold. 1. If a crisis is caused by willful human action, it follows that it can be solved by willful human action, which is the reason for Greta's constitutive rhetoric in the first place. 2. Consequences of purposeful human action open the door for stories about oppressors and victim narratives create pathos, as we've seen.
Crises based on the idea that some people are worth more than others and therefore have the right to steal others, to exploit others, and to steal their land.
I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood.
And people often respond well to pathos, making them say things like, how stunning and brave, about things that aren't stunning and brave.
The most affected people in the most affected areas still remain unheard. And the voices of future generations are drowning in their greenwash and empty words and promises. But the facts do not lie, and we know that our emperors are naked.
The facts do not lie. Isn't that a variation of what every emperor would say? Besides, it's pretty obvious that facts can't lie because they're facts. What's relevant is how she arrived at those facts. So which facts?
I mean, you can't say that there's one amount that is acceptable and not.
Also, before people can reliably evaluate what's a fact and what's not, they have to have the studies presented to them, including independent variables like who did the studies, who financed them, how did the researchers draw the conclusions, etc., none of which is present here or in other speeches.
Just look at the numbers. Look at the statistics. The science doesn't lie.
Greta treats science as if it's an animate and pure entity. However, people do science. Science doesn't do itself. People make estimations and draw conclusions. Rarely is science something objective you can go out and discover, but anything to keep the constitutive rhetoric going.
And we know we need immediate, drastic, annual emission cuts, unlike anything the world has ever seen. And as we don't have the technological solutions that alone will do anything even close to that, that means we will have to fundamentally change our society.
Sounds like such a safe future for the people she supposedly speaks on behalf of. Which emission cuts?
I mean, you can't say that there's one amount that is acceptable and not.
Oh yeah, that's right. My mistake. So what will this fundamental change look like? Sorry, I've got to stop asking these specific questions.
How dare you?
I know, how dare I? Let's sing instead.
We are unstoppable, another world is possible. 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 We are unstoppable.
To change
Well, not entirely unstoppable, because the singing start. Much to my dismay, of course.
So let's never stop. Let's continue the fight until we are done.
But that's the thing, Greta can't tell her fans when they're done, because there's no end goal. Narratives that play on people's indignation can't have an ending. That's it for now. Until next time.